I'd like to welcome everyone back. This is a bit of a unique situation. The live Zoomcast that we held actually last week, we had a technical glitch and we lost half of the talk by Boris Frankel. And Boris has been very, very generous with his time and agreed to do this all over again. So I'll really keep this short. I'd like to thank, as usual, Helle Panke and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung who finance these talks. I'd also like to thank Brave New Europe, who's let me off for the morning to redo this recording. And especially Boris, once again, for his generosity. And Boris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Now, for those who saw the first transmission, this is Mark II. So I will try and cover similar ground, but it will be not identical to the first talk that I presented last week. Now, just for those people who are familiar with much of the discourse on the climate emergency and environmental crises, we know that in recent decades, we could essentially divide responses to the climate crisis into three overall large groupings. The first grouping are the deniers, those people who deny that there is any problem with market capitalist economies and that there is no need to curb and decarbonize society. I'm not going to talk about those people because much has been written about them. The second group are the people who are conscious of the climate emergency, but are divided into two groups. And they straddle a range of political positions from small L liberals, social democrats, right through to a variety of different Keynesians, post-Keynesians and Marxist radicals, and of course, most green environmentalists. This large grouping are essentially divided between those people who wish to do something about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but are divided over whether that will involve major social change and doing something about inequality, not only within countries, but especially between the rich north, countries of the north, as it's called, and the poorer low and middle incomes of what's called the south. Most of these advocates support various forms of green growth, and they stretch right through from a range of political economists and major political parties who agreed that something should be done, but of course it is the rate of change that they are opposed. They don't want to, most of them do not wish to support rapid decarbonisation. And a certain minority of them are prepared to support social reforms that might alleviate inequality to a certain extent. But most of them are not critics of capitalist society, and they are not really linking the climate crisis to the socio-economic crisis. And then we have the third grouping, who are also divided. Many of them are very critical of capitalist society, but they are not united in terms of the solutions, how or what constitutes a post-capitalist or post-neoliberal society. And of course, we are familiar with these positions. They are mainly advocated by various supporters of degrowth, post-growth, and eco-socialism. So we have these three essential groupings, and the political stalemate that we see throughout the world is very much to do with the inability of one group to consolidate and dominate its position over the other two groups. And I'll come back to that hopefully in discussion a bit later on. If we take the climate crisis and situate it within the general political economic developments throughout the capitalist world, it is necessary to have some form of larger overview, which gives us some sense of the very significant transformative period that we are living through. And most of us tend not to be aware of this very important period of transformation. And as a result, most people lack any real sense of what the new so-called post-carbon society will look like. Will it be just another version of capitalism using renewable energy rather than fossil fuels? Will it be a society that doesn't have any democratic institutions, but is a variety of authoritarianism? Will it be a new society where it's not just witnessing a transformation of energy and other institutional structures, but it will be a post-capitalist society? So it's very important to get a sense of what type of policies, what type of strategies would lead to one or other of these particular endpoints, these particular social and political goals. And most people tend not to have any sense of where we've come from and where we're going to. Now, let us compare by contrast the situation of over 150 years ago. If we look at the emergence of capitalist societies in the 19th century, and especially in the period in the late 1860s and early 1870s, there was a major debate within the First Workers' International between Marx and his supporters and Bakunin and his anarchist supporters. They were both critical of capitalist societies, but they had quite different notions of how social change would come about. Bakunin, as you might recall, argued that the peasantry were the most important social class in society, and that this social class was going to be it was the majority of people at the time in the world, and that this social class, the peasantry and the rural labor workforce, were vital to making the revolution. Alongside this were what he called the lumpen proletariat, or the riffraff of society, the people who were prostitutes and thieves and a whole range of people who were not disciplined in factories and other workplaces. And they were also very critical of bourgeois behavior, of social norms. And Bakunin valued those people, together with the peasantry, as the major movers of social change. Marx, by contrast, as we know now, was an advocate of what he called the rising class of the working class, the proletariat. And as capitalism developed, Marx and Engels and others argued that the working class would constitute the majority of the population in most capitalist societies, and they would be the indispensable vital force that would make the revolution. Bakunin rejected Marx's notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat because he rejected the notion that there would be a state that would stand over these new revolutionaries and dictate to them what to do. Marx, by contrast, argued that without a working class dictatorship, the new revolution would be attacked and overthrown by bourgeois capitalist forces who would try to reinstate their social order. Now, as it turned out, And he argued that the state was only a provisional institutional structure which would eventually wither away. That was the ultimate hope of socialists at the time. As it turned out, both Marx and Bakunin were both wrong. The state actually proved to be indispensable in both sustaining capitalist societies and also in creating the material, social, institutional structures which would give them, the working class, the possibility of having a better standard of living, of having welfare services, of having education and health and all the other institutions. And historically, and of course, many people argued in the 20th century that Bakunin actually proved to be more prescient than Marx, because the revolutions that broke out in the 20th century were in peasant-based societies in Russia, in China, in Vietnam, and so forth. Whereas others argued, no, this argument that the peasantry were the key political revolutionary force was, in a sense, misguided, and that historical facts proved this to be true. Why? Because by the beginning, in the next decades after the 1870s, up until the First World War, the peasantry was rapidly declining and the working class were increasing numerically. By 1960, in the leading advanced capitalist countries across the world, in North America, in Western Europe, in Australia, in Japan, and so forth, the peasantry and rural workforce declined to approximately 5 to no more than 10% of the total workforce. And in fact, in many countries, such as Australia, the United States, Canada, and so forth, the agricultural workforce constitutes no more than 2% of the total workforce. So it was a declining force. Globally, where the majority of people were actually peasants or living in rural areas in the, around 1960, declined to no more than 28% of the total global population by 2015. So in recent years, the rural peasant population constitutes less than 30% of the total global population. It varies in various countries, of course, a great deal more than in others, but the total number of peasants and rural workers of various kinds has declined dramatically. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, the significance politically is that when Karl Kautsky wrote his famous books on the agrarian question in 1899, the 2 volumes that Lenin and other socialists ranked as the most important works after Marx's 3 volumes of Capital, that when Kautsky was writing about the agrarian question, the agrarian question was a very significant question in countries such as Germany and other European countries. But, and 20 years later, when Gramsci in Italy wrote about the need for a historic block between the working class in the northern Italian factories and the southern peasantry in the south of Italy, the question was, how could you form a political alliance of these 2 large social classes that would make some kind of alliance to overthrow capitalism? The other thing that Gramsci wrote about in the early 1930s was the way in which what he called Americanism and Fordism, based on Henry Ford's organization of mass production in Detroit, how this would eventually come to Europe and would overthrow the old forms of bourgeois family-run businesses, and we would see the development of a new form of capitalism in Europe. Well, and to a certain degree, he was proved right, but at another level, both Kautsky and Gramsci were, in a sense, if we look at them today, they are both historically obsolete in terms of their understanding of which social classes were going to make the revolution, or even bring about, as I will talk about shortly, post-carbon societies. In other words, if we look around the world today, in contrast to the left-wing movements of various types, whether they were reformist or they were revolutionary, in the first part of the 20th century, it was common to find many socialists talking about declining classes of the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. In other words, they were the decadent declining classes, and the rising class was the working class that had with it and brought with it a new culture and a new way of conceiving the world. Today, it's extremely difficult to find anybody who talks about rising and declining classes. We still have a lot of discussion about rising or declining powers, different nation states, the geopolitics of who is going to dominate in the world, what kind of hegemony is going to be based on either the Western Atlanticist model or the new rising powers in the emerging capitalist countries of the East, and so forth. But very few people talk about rising and declining social classes. Even on the right wing of the spectrum, on the liberal and conservative spectrum, if we go back 50 years ago and we examine the work of people like Daniel Bell, who wrote about the coming of the post-industrial society, he argued at the time that a new managerial knowledge class, in a sense, an information-based class, not the proletariat, not the bourgeoisie, would run society in the future. Now, at one level, we've certainly seen a massive increase in professional, administrative, technologically based professions. But Bell, when we read Bell, 50 years after he wrote his important book, he was completely mistaken about how this would affect capitalism. Capitalism has not changed in the sense that a new managerial knowledge class runs capitalism and the capitalist class has disappeared. Instead, we have seen what Bell failed to predict, the growth of these enormously powerful corporate bodies, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, and so forth. And they have made a mockery of Bell's notion of the disappearance of capitalism. They are even more powerful today than many of the powerful corporate giants of 100 years ago or more, of the Rockefellers and so forth. So that what we see today is transformed capitalism, the digital capitalism, the capitalism that's based on algorithms and what's called surveillance capitalism, but it is not a post-capitalism. And in that sense, both the liberal post-industrial theorists and the traditional left theorists of the rising working class have been proved incorrect. Now, just a few comments on the additional comments on the working class. As the peasantry declined by the 1950s, so we saw the working class, the industrial working class. I'm not speaking about the working class in service sector industries, but the working class in factories and so forth. They reached their peak in Western advanced capitalist countries by the 1960s. And since the 1960s, they have declined numerically. The actual global industrial workforce grew and reached its peak in the 1990s. So that when we add the millions of workers that joined the industrial workforce in China and South Korea and Vietnam and so many other different countries across the world, the total number of workers, as we know, was displaced both from traditional advanced capitalist countries in what we call the OECD, the Western countries, and moved eastwards. But it was not just a geographical displacement. It was also a transformation of those societies themselves. And if we are to understand who is going to make the post-carbon social transformation, which particular social class or grouping is going to shape it in their image, we have to have a sense and an understanding of how material resources, the material resources that are at the basis of all forms of living standards, of industrial and social production, how these material resources are extracted, how they're transformed and transported, how they're produced into goods and services, and then how is the waste coming from these material resources disposed of. If we don't have any understanding of this, we won't understand how the traditional notions of imperialism that were dominant at the time of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and other classical Marxist theorists, how that notion of imperialism is no longer operative in its traditional classical form. One particular example that I will cite is that up until the last 20 or so years ago, the majority of material resources were extracted and processed and transformed and sent to the leading capitalist countries in North America, Europe, Japan, Australia, and so forth. In the 21st century, most of the material resources, the ores, the biomass, the various, type of fossil fuels and so forth, are extracted in non-Western countries, in what's called the South, and they are consumed. 54% now is consumed by these countries like China and South Korea and the Vietnams and so forth. So we have seen a significant change in both the extraction and the consumption of material resources. And this is particularly important when you're trying to work out a strategy of how to decarbonize the world if countries like India and China, that account for 40% of the global population, are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, especially coal and other fossil fuels. And they are very both reluctant to rapidly decarbonize because the consequences for these societies will be social convulsion if their growth rates fall below a certain level. And so regardless of how many people in the West, whether all the environmental activists in Germany or in Sweden or whatever, or America or Australia wish to rapidly decarbonize, there is no possibility of a radical decrease in the consumption of fossil fuels without the very strong cooperation of these major emerging capitalist countries. The other very important consequence of the changing transformation is that the shifting balance in the use of material resources and the shifting balance of power in different capitalist countries means that the old strategies of relying on the working class, the industrial working class, no longer functions in the way that it did in the first half of the 20th century and even into the decades after, up until, say, the 1970s. If we look at the key agents of political social pressure, we can see that coal miners, dock workers on the ships, and railway workers were heavily unionized. They were often unionized by left wing, whether they were Labour, Social Democratic, or Communist Party unions. They were at the forefront of many industrial disputes because they played an indispensable role in terms of keeping the capitalist economies going. So that if we compare the power of industrial unions in these areas with the role of miners today in many countries, we can see that they are divided. Many of them are not interested in supporting the end of fossil fuels because it means that they will lose their jobs. It means that there have been serious clashes between miners and environmentalists in a range of countries, whether Australia or Germany or the United States or whatever. And this means that you have a disunited set of political movements compared to earlier times. So the problem then becomes, how do you develop a united political response to the climate emergency? And how is this not only developed within individual capitalist countries, but how does it develop across the European Union or across the world that embraces the Indias and the Chinas and other powers as well? The other thing I'd like to say is that when we look at the way in which we think about the move towards a post-carbon society and the environmental crisis, we have to be very much aware that we are still living under the shadow of the group of writers who wrote in the period between the 1840s and the 1940s, especially the people who were active both politically and as theorists of political economy and of society, cultural critique and so forth, from the period from 1900 until the late 1940s. And I'm thinking here of all the classics, not only Marx and Lenin and Gramsci and Luxemburg, but also the Gramscis and the various theorists, supporters, both liberal and conservative supporters of market societies, the Max Webers, the Schumpeter's, the Hayeks, a range of, different, John Maynard Keynes, all of these people were very much developing their theories in that period of the 4 decades of the 20th century. And many of the responses that we find today towards the political economic crises, in whether it was the great financial crisis of 2008 or whether it's the environment crisis or whatever, many people, both Keynesians of various varieties and Marxists of various varieties, still say very little about how the environment affects their traditional theories. In other words, most of these theorists who developed their ideas from the late 19th century until the 1940s were what I call pre-environmentalists. so that all the debates about labor versus capital, about political organization, about all the different, how to counter different, what's called bourgeois ideology, how to theorize the role of the state, what is the role of political economy in determining whether there should be a greater public sector or a free market. In other words, all these debates were very much influenced by an earlier generation of theorists who took for granted that material resources would constitute no real problem about developing a sustainable society. The main problem was how to either redistribute these and make these more equal so that the working class benefited from these rather than the minority capitalist class, or on the capitalist side, how you could develop a capitalist economy that would grow, continually grow, without interruptions from workers or from recessions or depressions. So these debates about how to manage capitalist societies, one way or the other, or to overthrow capitalist societies and develop a socialist society, paid minimal attention to how the developing capitalist societies or the new socialist societies would be environmentally sustainable. Of course, there were plenty of theorists, whether it was Marx and himself or whether it was theorists like Adorno and Marcuse writing, in the 30s and the 40s, who were very concerned about the consequence of capitalism on the domination of nature. The same is true of the Karl Polanyi's writing in the 30s and the 40s. They were very worried about how capitalism would destroy nature if it was not stopped. But these few brief comments that they made here and there in their writings are in no way equivalent to how do you develop a theory of the economy that it takes into account, that seriously and in detail takes into account how to utilize material resources in a manner that does not destroy environments. This, in a sense, is lacking in their works. Now, so what we have at the moment are a whole range of people on the left who are very concerned about the climate crisis, but who are yet to develop detailed analyses of how we envisage an alternative economy which does not deplete and transform and abuse material resources. We're yet to see this. Those theorists who take the use, the extraction and production and consumption of materials resources very seriously and place them at the center of their political analysis are all those people who belong to what we call the degrowth and the post-growth school and eco-socialists. So that they're very concerned not just about decarbonisation, but at how we can create a more equal society by addressing the tremendous imbalances between the wealthy countries and the low and middle income countries in terms of their consumption of material resources. The problem, as I argue in my books, Democracy versus Sustainability and Capitalism versus Democracy, the Rethinking Politics in the Age of Environmental Crisis. In both of those books, I am sympathetic to the post-growthers and the degrowthers because I do not believe that capitalism is sustainable if it continues on its current trajectory. But I am very critical of the failure of degrowthers and post-growthers to develop an understanding and a conception of the political, economic, institutional structures that we need to create a more equal society. In other words, most of the post-growthers and degrowthers can show what's wrong with capitalist society and its incessant growth patterns and why this is destructive. But they fall back mainly on local solutions. They have no real adequate understanding of how the local on its own, small communities, can actually be sustainable without either regional or national or supranational, international state institutions to help coordinate the use of material resources and to coordinate the distribution of these in a more equitable manner. Just to give one example, if we do not know what degrowthers actually wish to degrow and they wish to grow. In other words, if you talk to most and read the material from degrowthers and post-growthers, when you read their work, they do not mean that everything will cease growing, but they want to stop the growth in automobile industries, military weapons creation, bottled water, and these other very, obvious targets. But they do not explain to us how what they call planned degrowth will actually occur. In other words, if degrowthers wish to avoid the crises, the economic crises of a major recession or depression, where millions of people are thrown out of work and unemployment and poverty increases, how do you create degrowth? Which sectors of society and the economy have to be planned to degrow? And how do you coordinate this so that there isn't social chaos, that there isn't what ultimately turns out to be something similar or worse than a capitalist recession? This is not just a trivial issue, but goes right to the heart of the matter of what are the political conceptions of social change. And we do not see this adequately spelt out by the degrowthers and the post-growthers. Some of them talk about, yes, there will be, the state will still remain, but most of activity will be devolved to the local. Of course, we have no notion of what the local actually means. Does it mean small towns and cities of maybe 5 to 50,000 people? Or does the local also mean cities of 1 million, 2 million, the many cities that have 5 to 10 million, and the mega cities, the Cairos, the Sao Paulos, the Tokyos, and others that have 30 or more million people? When we're talking about the local, we're talking about cities today that are far larger than Denmark, Lebanon, and many of these countries with small populations of 5 to 8 million or whatever. This is the problem. How do you organize these cities? And how are they? And most cities, of course, and most communities are not sufficient, are not self-sufficient in material resources. 80% of the world's population today cannot be self-sufficient. In other words, they have to depend on importing either food or material resources, whether mining or other items, or goods and services that they cannot produce themselves. And this constitutes a major problem about how you sustain the viability of degrowth communities, because many degrowthers do not even support a national political organization and believe that we should not go down the path of conventional political parties. But if you have no national organization, and you only have quasi-anarchist local communities where people directly manage their local communes, their communities, then this sounds fine in democratic theory, but will prove to be grossly inadequate in dealing with the complete imbalance in material resources in the world today as we find it. This also raises another related question, which is not just applicable to degrowthers and post-growthers, but really affects both the social democratic and radical Marxist left in Europe as a whole, as well as in other countries, but especially in Europe. And in the last couple of decades, we've seen major divisions between those people on the left who are very much opposed to the European Union, would like to have leave the European Union and develop what's called a left national social democracy, or a left particular green type of national state. We've seen this particularly developed by German political theorist Wolfgang Streeck, and in Britain, New Left Review editors. And I am also supportive of their critique of the European Union. I mean, we shouldn't have any pretense about the European Union being some benign, wonderful institution. It is principally a neoliberal institution that presides over inequality, but it is not, but the solution, the alternative to the European Union, in my opinion, is not to go down the national path. Because if we examine this very closely, what does a national economy mean if it has very little connection to other national economies? It means that all the 27, or 28 if we include the United Kingdom, 28 economies have to develop, if they want to not depend on large imports. It means that they have to develop their steel industry, their car industries, or some other industries, that they have to develop their own food production process. They have to develop a whole range of industries that are environmentally absolutely disastrous. It would mean duplication. It would mean back to a situation of, say, 70 or 80 years ago, when there was overproduction of these resources in Europe, where the coal and steel and iron industries in France and Germany and Italy and other countries had to be cut back because they were completely uncompetitive. You could say, well, we're not going for a capitalist economy, we're going for national socialist societies. Well, even a socialist society based just on the nation state would have serious problems about how to survive in a world that would still be not all socialist. I mean, this is a figment of people's imagination. We have to think about a world where societies, everybody in the world moves, simultaneously becomes capitalist and then simultaneously becomes socialist over a short period of time. This is not the world as it is constituted at the moment, and is unlikely to be the world that we will face in the coming decades. Rather, we will face a world where if radical left or other governments ever come to power in particular nation states, they will encounter hostile, competitive capitalist countries that will try to ensure that they either don't grow and are defeated, but more importantly, or equally importantly, we cannot go back to the same level of employment that existed in the 1950s and 1960s, because the labor-saving devices that have been implemented in the last 60 or more years in capitalist industries has meant that even if these left governments were to take power in Germany or Britain or the Netherlands or Italy, they would not be able to deliver to their workforces the same level of employment in factories and so forth, simply because they are not going to operate on the old labor-intensive basis that was true of that particular period decades ago. They are now today operating in sophisticated technological production processes. So we have a problem not just of the use of material resources, but the use, how do you employ people again? So you then have to think about how do you sustain people either in shorter working weeks or in employment in different industries, because most people today work in the service sector. Only a declining percentage, it varies from country to country in the capitalist world, but approximately 8 to 20% of the workforce are to be found in industrial manufacturing, and the vast majority of people are to be found in various private and public sector services. And a tiny percentage are in mining and agriculture. So we have to think of what kind of post-carbon society we wish to construct. And I see in Europe that unless people think about democratizing and socializing the European Union, I can't see, and I know that this is an agenda that sounds like a pipe dream, but so is the pipe dream, so is national sovereignty a pipe dream. I mean, both of these require massive political struggle to either achieve independence for Italy or some other country to break away from the EU, or it requires a massive change so that people in most countries of the EU develop a more comprehensive social state that starts to develop simultaneously both a sustainable economy, an environmentally sustainable economy, and a comprehensive social state. This will require transforming the taxation system, the regulatory structures, and so forth. I won't go into this at the moment because there have been many discussions of this. But what's important about having a sense of where we're going is that you can go off in a complete dead end if you don't look at the way in which material resources have to be used, you know, how they're extracted, and they have to be ultimately used. And I think far too many Keynesian and Marxists have not adequately addressed this to this day. And that's what I've tried to discuss in my books. Excuse me. Let's take some of the problems that are traditionally conceived as maintaining growth. I'm not talking about the degrowths here, and I'm not in favor of incessant growth. So I just want to reiterate that point. I'm now going to talk very briefly about those Keynesian, post-Keynesians, and others on the left who examine different capitalist societies, and they compare the type of growth strategies that they have adopted. Now, before neoliberalist policies developed in the late 1970s, the most Keynesian economists in that argued that wage growth was closely related to increases in productivity. So there was a trade-off. Workers worked harder, productivity increased, they received wage increases, and wage growth helped families and individuals to improve their standards of living. Wage growth was replaced in the late 1970s and early 80s by what we call financialization, so that people like Colin Crouch called this privatized Keynesianism. In other words, household expenditure depended on going increasingly into debt. And so instead of wages boosting their demand, it was increased debt that increased demand for goods and services. And so we saw that the economies have used that type of strategy in modified form right up until today. So what we can see, according to these Keynesian theorists, and they look at the varieties of capitalism, what they divide capitalist countries into are those that are based on export-led growth, and export-led growth usually means some form of austerity, because if business are to be globally competitive, it means that they have to keep a lid on wages. They have to make sure that their labor costs and their general demand for welfare services does not increase, because this is all cost expenditure. And that will make the export-led countries such as Germany more globally competitive. In contrast to export-led economies, we have consumption-led economies. And this is usually favored by right-wing and center-left governments who wish to keep the electorate in their own country happy by fostering more consumption-led growth. Consumption-led growth usually depends on higher levels of debt, higher levels of imports, and as a result, supplements those type of economies, especially that are based on few industries that are highly dependent on tourism and other services. And then we have those countries that are investment-led, that is, depending on the level of state and private sector investment, that helps the economies grow, because a certain level of investment will result in a certain level of construction and development. And closely linked to state investment-led growth is state-led growth that we've seen in countries like China, South Korea, and so forth, where they help develop the private capitalist sector by managing through various plans and direct intervention to target certain industries and see these industries develop so that they become ultimately both export leaders and also provide goods and services for their own communities. Now, most countries adopt a mixture of export-led and consumption-led growth patterns. Very few countries have state planning to control. They have various forms of indicative planning, like in China, and many countries, even in the United States, they have various forms of state planning that is mainly located in the military industrial complex. They plan ahead which type of heavy, sophisticated weapons they're going to develop, what kind of transport systems they'd like to see, and so forth. So there are forms of planning in all capitalist countries, but there is very little discussion today of the debates that took place from the 1920s until the early 1980s between supporters of free markets and supporters of state planning, whether it was central planning, decentralized planning, market socialism, and so forth. Most of these debates have disappeared. Only a few people engage in these debates today. Now, why are these important? Well, If you have an export-led economy and you are driving your growth through exports, as most of the emerging capitalist countries in South and North Asia are doing, then most of these economies are actually presiding over environmental disasters. Export-led growth is not always, far from compatible with environmental sustainability. The same is true of wage-led growth, consumption-led growth based on debt. The constant growth in wages, as we saw during the post-1945 period up until the mid-1970s, cannot continue in that form. We cannot see consumer growth being environmentally compatible. So we have to think of what kind of economy would be possible where essential services, healthcare, housing, public transport, education, water, sewerage, electricity, internet and other electronic provisions are available for all people, and how this infrastructure and these services can be provided without generating unnecessary consumer growth, which has its limits. The same is true of state-led or investment-led growth. The largest sector in terms of extraction and use of material resources is in the land use and construction sector. It is larger than the fossil fuel sector in terms of material resources used. And so if you have most investment going into construction, either private housing estates, speculative investment of property, deforestation to clear areas for property development, all these particular destructive uses of marine areas for luxury apartments and holiday resorts. And you're all familiar with the endless type of developments that we've seen in the last 40 years or so. Not only is this completely unsustainable, but there has to be a reorientation of development in the housing construction and land use sector so that not only social needs are addressed for the vast majority of people who are still without electricity and running water, the hundreds of millions in the world today, the 1 billion plus people, more people employed in the informal market sector, the informal economy, working for unregulated, very low wages compared to the total global workforce working in the formal sector, whether in manufacturing or services or whatever. So we have to look at how those major economies in China and India and the whole perimeter of South Asia, the Indonesias, the Nigerias, the whole belt, of countries in Latin America that still have enormous numbers of people highly dependent on extracting resources, exporting them to China or Northeast Asia for processing, and have very little social industrial structures developing them for their own popular needs. There is, as I said, very little discussion of how these material resources can be used. Now, just a few words on, and what is striking about, just to conclude about most of these Keynesian, post-Keynesian economies that talk about export-led, consumption-led, investment-led or state-led economies, they don't say a word about the environment. You can read they might mention in a few sentences, one or two sentences here, yes, we have to do something about the climate crisis. But most of them say nothing, virtually nothing about what type of a growth economy is compatible with new type of engines of growth. In other words, how do we keep our workforce employed? How do we sustain services? How do we, whether we need certain levels of exports or certain levels of imports? Very few things are said about this. On the other side of the fence, when we look at degrowthers and post-growthers, most of them tend to subscribe to Herman Daly's notion of the steady state economy. Now, ecological economists and a whole range of degrowthers take the steady state as gospel. In other words, very few of them undertake a detailed critique and understanding of what Herman Daly's notion of the steady state was based on. For those who are not familiar with Herman Daly, he wrote and coined the term the steady state back in the 1970s, and he developed a conception of how new economies, he was opposed to growthism, that he called. He wanted to eliminate growth in material resources, and he wanted to develop an economy that was based on a steady state where the throughput, that he called the throughput of material resources from extraction through to production, consumption, and waste disposal, was based on a steady state, so that you reached what he called an equilibrium. Now, in theory, this sounds terrific. Wouldn't it be great if we could all, if each country could develop a steady state economy at local and national level, and it would balance the imports of resources that it needed, or the local extraction of them, with the production and consumption of them, and over a period of either a year or a few years, it would reach an equilibrium. The problem, you see, with Herman Daly is that he based his notion of a steady state on neoclassical economics of a market that reached equilibrium between supply and demand. And he had these completely, what I would regard naive and absurd notions of what type of societies existed in Europe and Japan. For example, he called Switzerland and Sweden socialist economies. And he said we should aim for a level of inequality or wage differential, income difference, of not more than 1 to 10 or 1 to 100. Now, 1 to 10 is a massive difference, just as 1 to the highest income of 100 times the lowest income is a massive form of inequality. Now, when you compare this to the multi-billionaires, the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks and all these other billionaires, of course, that rate of inequality is not as large as 10 to 1, or, I mean, that's far greater, as I said, than what Daly was advocating. But it is not a more equal society. And Sweden and Switzerland and these other so-called socialist economies were not socialist. Japan, he also said, was moving to a steady state. I mean, this is complete misreading of Japan. I mean, Japan has been having low growth, not because it was moving to a steady state, but because it had a property collapse in the 30 years ago. And it's offshored, it's sent a lot of its industry offshore, and it is still very much a fossil fuel-based, consumer-oriented economy that is far from what degrowthers would see as an ideal steady state future post-carbon society. So what I'm saying here is that we have to be very careful about aiming for something that is not possible economically. No capitalist economy has ever achieved perfect equilibrium, has been able to eliminate recessions and depressions for 200 years. And even during the period when there was much more state regulation and interventionist Keynesian management, that resulted in recessions in the 1970s. So we've got to be very careful in aiming for some kind of artificial steady state economy. We have to recognize that steady state is not the normal state of economies, that there is conflict in all societies. Conflict will continue. And the question is how this conflict can be minimized, how different societies and economies relate to one another in a very hostile and competitive world, and how we manage the transition to a post-carbon range of societies. And these post-carbon societies will not be of one type. They will be of many types. Some will be democratic, some will be authoritarian, and so forth. The other thing that I'd like to conclude with before answering some questions is that there is this very disappointing and artificial notion of how we change the actual extraction and consumption of material resources that comes mainly from degrowthers. Now, we don't have to say a great deal about knowing that the majority of people in affluent countries in Western Europe, North America, Australia, and Japan have consumed high levels of material resources. Some of them, we don't know the exact figures, and I'll come to this in a minute, compared with so many countries in low income and middle income countries that only consume a fraction. We don't have to go into this. This is a very well-known point. The problem is, how do we, and degrowthers advocate that we should see a redistribution of wealth and cut material consumption in Europe, America, Australia, and Japan by up to 90%, and let the poorer countries increase their consumption of material resources. Now, I don't need to tell you, but I will tell you that any political movement or party that goes forward and tries to campaign on cutting 20% of people's material resources, let alone 70, 80, or 90%, will get nowhere in the current political world. I mean, it is just not politically possible or feasible to cut such a level. We would have a mass depression in Western capitalist countries if growth was cut. The problem is that we are not even told by degrowthers what is to degrowth and what is to be cut, and how is cutting our level of consumption, is it to be redistributed physically, or we're simply not going to import and utilize those resources? And we have to be very clear. I mean, in Europe, for example, Europe relies on a third more land and marine resources than in the whole of Europe to supply its food and its fish diet. So Europe has to come to terms with how it uses its land use. And as we know, the European Union has at least investigated how to introduce better land management. Far from efficient and adequate. Many kind of loopholes that You still give developers a reasonably free run and so forth. But no other country and area in the world is even looking at managing its land resources, its material resources. And biomass, the actual food production process, is absolutely critical. Look at countries like Australia and New Zealand. You see pictures, you know, of New Zealand, these beautiful landscapes of mountains and rich green fields. But very few people recognize or are aware that 80 or more % of New Zealand's rivers and waterways are polluted with green algae as a result of dairy production, private farmers using nitrogen, you know, the fertilizers and that, and it flows into all these rivers and is killing them. And the dairy industry is New Zealand's largest export industry, so that most of it goes to the growing affluent middle class in the Chinas and the Indias and Malaysias and Japans and South Koreas and so forth. So that the same in Australia. The food basket of Australia is very fragile. The Murray-Darling River is a very large river that flows from the north to the south. And there are still many, both political parties, major parties in Australia, are still putting forward this ludicrous notion, this environmentally unsustainable notion that Australia can massively increase its food exports by developing increasing its agricultural exports to the rest of the world. It's just not environmentally feasible. The Murray-Darling is already choked by the rice producers and the cotton producers and the Canadian pension funds that invest in almond mass farming and others that all require massive amounts of water that is creating desertification. You know, it's deforestation. And it's the same is true in many areas of the world. So that how do you shift the material resource use? Well, we know how material resources were shifted at the end in 1945. The Soviet troops that defeated the Nazis then transported back to the Soviet Union whole factories and machinery to war-ravaged Soviet Union. Well, you can't transport machinery and buildings and all this to low and middle income countries in the same way. It's just not on. So you have to work out, how do we develop a better use of material resources? The other critical thing about material resources that is most of the analysts who discuss the unequal use of material resources in the world today use very limited, unsatisfactory statistics that are mainly developed by international agencies, such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, the United Nations, the Eurostat, the OECD, and so forth. And the categories that they use to distinguish and evaluate material resources are so crude that they leave any kind of, they're mainly averaging statistics. So they look at the total amount of so-called material resources used in a particular country, like Germany or Australia or whatever, and then they divide the population of Germany or Australia into the total number of tons of material resources, and then they arrive at what's called a per capita level of consumption. And you get the, so in various advanced capitalist countries, you get statistics such as each individual consumes maybe 25 to 35 tons of material resources per annum, compared to somebody in India or in Sri Lanka or in Botswana or somewhere consuming 3, 1 or 2 or 5 tonnes per annum. The problem is that these statistics do not tell us about the gross inequalities within each of the nation states. So we do not know what the actual level of different households, whether they are high income households that might consume up to 100 tonnes per annum per capita, and low income households that might consume 10 or 11 or 12 tonnes per annum. The United Nations Environmental Programme argued back in 2011 and 2014 that we should try to equalize per capita use of material resources to no more than 6 to 8 tonnes per person per annum across the world. And they based this on this arbitrary figure of 50 billion tonnes of material resources were being used. And if we kept our limit to 50 billion tonnes, then the world would be sustainable. In 1970, the global consumption of material resources was approximately 27 million tonnes per annum. 27 billion tonnes per annum. By 2020, not 2000, by 2020, it had increased from 27 billion tonnes to over 100 billion tonnes. So currently we are consuming approximately 100 billion tonnes of material resources globally. This figure is projected to increase to 180 billion tonnes by 2050. That is in less than 28 years. So to reduce those type of figures from 100 billion tonnes to 50 billion tonnes, so that each person consumed not more than 6 or so tonnes per individual, is just politically impossible. And yet degrowthers continue about this, and that's why they talk about 90% cut in consumption. But they do not tell us which households in affluent Western countries and large, over a third of the population in many countries in America, Australia, Britain, Germany, and various other places are not affluent households. So we have to know which sectors, which areas have to be cut, or that their quality of life is improved. Now, what we have seen also that has to be taken into account is that the way in which in advanced capitalist countries, households have changed their consumption of material resources. In America, for example, in the 1950s and 1960s, durable goods, that is cars, household appliances, not very durable, they only lasted several years, but they were called durable goods by the statisticians. They constituted about 46% of GDP. In the next 60 years, by the beginning of the 21st century, it was services that had increased dramatically, so that services now constitute far more than the consumption of material goods in advanced capitalist countries. By the way, the durable goods, there are durable goods, and then there are non-durable goods, which are mainly food, clothing, and fuel. So that if you combine durable goods and non-durable goods and services as the third sector, we've seen significant changes between the three sectors. So what we have to try and develop is a political strategy where we see durable goods made truly durable so that they're repairable and that they last not for 5 or 10. We have to eliminate planned obsolescence. We have to change our pattern of non-durable goods consumption, that is, get rid of fossil fuels, and we have to and replace them with renewables. And we have to have a close look at services, because there is a myth that services do not rely heavily on material resources. This is nonsense, because if you are working in the health sector or education or property development or the military apparatus, all of these services, so to say, depend on material resources to build hospitals, schools, investment buildings, weapons, and so forth. The question is, can the construction of, say, services for public need be made more durable and more replacing wage-based goods, so that we have a greater increase in basic services for people and less of their reliance on wage income? Whether that balance can be developed politically in the future. Without those type of shifts, and to see, especially in the emerging capitalist countries, as they're called, a significant shift from export-led growth to the use of material resources for their own needs. Because remember, we're going to see a major crisis in the next 20 or so years of all those fossil fuel-based economies, especially in the Middle East, in countries like Nigeria, in the Mexicos and Brazils and the Venezuelas and all those countries that depend on oil or gas or petrodollars for their exports. In Latin America and Australia are very much connected to the growth of the East Asian and South Asian economies. They have very little of their own self-sufficient economies. And so you cannot have change in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East without a significant transition to a different type of income earning structure. So just to conclude, and I haven't discussed many other aspects, if we do not look at the way in which the notion of a post-carbon society is envisaged, how it's going to emerge, who is going to make this post-carbon society, which social classes, what will they need to do to keep this new society politically viable so it does not get overthrown either in an election by an incoming government that says, no, we're not going that way, or more violently through a coup d'etat or something like that. We have to have some notion of what makes up the material resources of a particular society. How can each locality, each region, each national area, and each region like an EU or something develop its material resources use that makes it viable in the future? So thanks very much for listening.
I'd like to thank you very, very much. I'd also like to thank once again Helle Pamke and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Brave New Europe for making this possible. And I assume we'll see each other in March with the next Zoomcast. And that's it for tonight, or today, depending where you are.
Thank you very much, Mathew.
All right.
All the best.
All right, you too.